Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest updates from the front line. Starting out, we have seen some territorial changes. We can start out in the Zaporizhzhia front, where the Ukrainian forces have advanced a slight bit here to the north of Robotyne, expanding their zone of control a bit eastwards and evening out the front line a bit as they capture further forest lines here in this part of the front line and advance towards the Russian defensive positions here to the south of this area. So they're closing in on the Russian defensive line that goes through the village of Verbove. So they're fairly close to the first line of defense in this part of the front line, only a few kilometers, approximately 5 kilometers from the front line. So we are closing in on the fighting where the Russian forces will actually face the Ukrainians head on. Then we take a look at the area by Velika Novosilka. Although there's been no territorial changes here, there has been a renewal of the offensive in this direction, and we're seeing two main focuses of the Ukrainian forces. They're attacking in the direction of Priyutne as well as in the direction of Staromayorsk. As I mentioned in my previous video, this is because we see that in the central area or in this part of the front line, the Russian positions are located by the river line and through the villages here, which would essentially mean that if the Ukrainian forces attack straight through the center, then they would be vulnerable from all directions. So instead they're attacking both from the western side and from the eastern side in the direction of Staromayorsk and Priyutne. Then we move on further northeast in the direction of the Bakhmut front, where the Ukrainian forces have managed to advance and capture this part right here. In a video showcased right here, we see a Ukrainian tank attacking Russian trenches. So this is actually footage where the Ukrainian tank is in this direction here and fighting in the direction of the trenches here to the east, as well as by the forest line itself. So what we're saying is that the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks here to the southern flank of the Bakhmut area as they try to advance through the canal line to flank the Russian positions by Klishivka and take control over the trench networks to the southwest of the village, after which we'll see them focus on the northern trenches, which will allow them to have full control over the village, and then they can address the front line to be by the railway here to the east of the canal, as well as allow them to attack the further crossing points here to the south by Kurtyomivka through the canal line, allowing them to advance and cross over at multiple points. Moving to the northwest of Bakhmut, we see that the Ukrainian forces also managed to advance a slight bit here to the southeast or northeast of Odyhovo-Vasilivka by the E40 highway. They're slowly advancing through in this area. The first advance was 2 days ago, then we saw another advance yesterday, and now we may see some further advances as the Ukrainian forces are trying to push through in this area, cutting off the road between the E40 highway and Slaviansk, which would cut off the supplies on the Russian forces onto this village, and then move further down south towards Bakhmut, which would cut off the Vasilivka and Berikivka. So essentially they're tracking in multiple directions in this way to keep the Russian forces down to the southern parts, while they're using the main push in the northern parts to cut them off. Then we move back down south to the Avdiivka area, where here the Ukrainian forces managed to advance here slightly west of Krasnohorivka, where they managed to capture parts of the fields here to the west of the village, as well as this trench network here to the south of Krasnohorivka. We see here that it is a one that faces eastwards, which means that unless the Russian forces expanded it was not well located for the Russian forces. Meanwhile, it also oversees this part to the east, which means that it's a well prepared position for the Ukrainian forces. So now that they have regained control of it, it oversees this southern part of Krasnohorivka, which is why we are seeing the gray zone move further eastwards, because the Russians have to retreat to their cover. After this, we take a look at the Bilohorivka area, where here the Russian forces have managed to capture this part right here, the zone here to the east of the village itself. This is an industrial zone of the village. As we can see, there is this major coal plant, and this is where they process it. So essentially with this, the Russian forces now have a foothold within the village, as this allows them to conduct operations from this location, principally in the direction of the coal plant, but also in the direction of the village itself. And in this video where we're talking about the territorial changes, we're also going to cover an interview where Zaluzhnyi talked about the offensive to the Washington Post, about how the offensive operations have restarted, different axes of fighting, and the movement of Russian troops outside the country of Belarus, as well as the Wagner troops. So before we get into that, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, as it helps me out a lot, and you'll be able to get notified every time I upload so that you are able to follow the situation closely as I update every day. And make sure to check out my PayPal and Patreon. It is down in the description. On Patreon, you get exclusive content to all my subscribers on there. And on PayPal, it will just be if you want to help me out and send me a small donation. Thank you everyone for watching, and let's get straight into the next part, which is the interview Zaluzhnyi did with the Washington Post. I've picked out specific parts that I believe are the most interesting and most important from the interview. First off, we have this part where Zaluzhnyi expressing his frustration with how the West is reacting to this offensive. For almost 4 weeks now, the offensive has been ongoing, and they have managed to capture these small parts of the front line at the point of contact, not even reaching the first line of defense. He says this reason for this lack of success, lack of speed in this operation is due to their lack of their own air power. He even mentions that throughout this offensive, the Russian forces have had an artillery advantage of 10-1. That means every time the Ukrainians are able to launch a single artillery shell, the Russians respond with 10 artillery shells. And that is beside the fact that the Russians have their Ka-52 helicopters. They are under defensive, so the Ukrainians have to pass through large heaps of minefields. And all of these factors that gives the Russians a huge advantage in comparison to the attacking Ukrainians. He claims that they are unable to have major success, and throughout all of this, they are continuously asking for F-16 fighter jets. They have received a few promises, but he mentions at the very best, at the very earliest, he'll receive them in the fall. So essentially, they are going to continue this offensive with these large amounts of disadvantages. And he drives this analogy that because there's no other way, because the enemy is using a different generation of aviation, it's like we go on the offensive with bows and arrows now. So he's comparing this to essentially them going out with bows and arrows in comparison to guns and tanks and helicopters and airplanes. This is the level of difference between the Russian equipment and the Ukrainian equipment, especially because the Russians are on the defensive and they have large amounts of their equipment, which is also advanced. In comparison, the Ukrainians have, yes, they have advanced equipment, but they're lacking aspects such as their air power, and at the same time, what they have is very limited in comparison to the Russian forces. Yet, although that is the current situation, that the Russians have such a significant advantage, they have still decided to restart their offensive operations. They've started attacking here south of Oryhiv in the direction of Verbove, as well as Robotyne in the latest updates done by the pro-Russian sources, since the Ukrainian sources do not report on the advances. However, there's also been some Ukrainian sources by the Ministry of Defense that claims fighting happening by Verbove. So the Ukrainian forces are attacking in this direction of Robotyne and Verbove, as well as to the northeast by the Remelsky Lech, here in the direction of Staromayorsk, as well as Pryotne, as they try to attack these villages. So although there is this 10-1 artillery advantage on the Russian side, as well as Russians having complete air superiority on the front line, they're still continuing their offensive operations. And in the meantime, the Russian forces have also restarted their offensives to the west of Kreminna. This actually gives me an idea that the Russian forces are not actually planning to attack in this direction. Whenever the Ukrainian forces restart their offensive operations in the Zaporizhzhia front, they start some of their own operations by the Kreminna area, which indicates that they are trying to pressure the Ukrainian forces by essentially signaling them, if you pour more and more resources in the Zaporizhzhia front, you'll be more vulnerable in other areas, and we're going to take advantage of that. So the Russian forces are here trying to display a message to the Ukrainians that you're not capable of launching a full-scale offensive in the Zaporizhzhia front, because as soon as you do so, the Russian forces will just launch their own and they'll be able to attack on the other parts of the front line. So they have to think about the risks involved in launching this offensive. Finally, we have some reports of the Russian forces and their troop movements, as well as the Wagner forces and their troop movement. So far there has been built a location for Wagner troops here to the southeast of Minsk, the capital of Belarus. And this is very interesting because that would be at the exact center of the country. The first is away from any borders, but that also means that they can be deployed in any direction on equal time frame. So if they want to be deployed to the north, west, south, or east, no matter what it is, they'll be able to do it from that location. Some other sources like Remy himself, he's reporting to me that the Wagner forces, 25,000 of them have entered the territory of Belarus, and thousands more will be arriving as well in the coming days. Also that the Russian forces are also sending several of their own units to Belarus, and that their training has already started. So this could indicate that this extra reserve army that the Russian forces have prepared is being sent to Belarus rather than anywhere else. Not saying that this is the exact same army, but it could be if the Russian Ministry of Defense, Shoigu, is speaking the truth about these forces, then they may be sent to Belarus together with the Wagner forces, which would together form an offensive force of about 200,000 troops, which would be able to launch any offensive in the direction of the north of Ukraine, which would force Ukraine to fortify the northern part and divert troops from other areas to the northern front to prevent the Russian forces from attacking from their back, exposed from the lack of forces in this direction in comparison to the Russian forces. And that is all I have for you in today's video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and check me out on Patreon and PayPal.